What if I told you that scientists released hundreds of beavers onto completely barren desert land where no water had flowed for decades, and these aquatic mammals somehow transformed 2,000 acres of lifeless wasteland into the most biodiverse wetland ecosystem in the American Southwest? It sounds impossible, right? Well, this is exactly what happened along Arizona's San Pedro River over the past 25 years. And the result has created one of conservation's most extraordinary success stories. This is that incredible tale of resurrection. But to understand why anyone would release water-dependent animals into waterless desert, we need to go back to the 1800s. The San Pedro River was once known as one of the Southwest's most important riparian ecosystems. This perennial river flowed year-round through the Sonoran Desert, creating a ribbon of life that supported an astonishing diversity of wildlife in one of North America's most arid regions. Picture this. Before European settlement, the San Pedro River supported over 400 species of birds, more than any other location in the United States. Massive cottonwood forests lined the riverbanks, creating cool, humid microclimates that provided refuge for countless species during the brutal desert summers. Jaguars, ocelots, and Mexican wolves roamed the riparian forests. The river itself teemed with native fish species that existed nowhere else on Earth. But the San Pedro wasn't just an ecological treasure, it was a geological marvel. The river flowed through volcanic rock formations and desert mountains, carving a green corridor through landscape that received less than 12 inches of rainfall annually. The key to this oasis was a complex system of beaver dams that had existed for thousands of years, creating a chain of pools and wetlands that stored water year-round and recharged underground aquifers. The numbers surrounding the river's historical abundance were staggering. Early explorers described beaver populations in the thousands, with their dams creating over 200 permanent pools along just 50 miles of river. These dams didn't just store surface water, they created underground water storage systems that maintained stream flow even during severe droughts. The beaver-engineered hydrology supported ecosystems that were more biodiverse than many tropical rainforests. But this paradise began to unravel in the 1860s when fur trappers discovered the San Pedro's beaver populations. The California gold rush had created enormous demand for beaver pelts, and the San Pedro represented one of the Southwest's last untapped beaver resources. Professional trappers systematically destroyed the beaver populations, killing thousands of animals in just 2 decades. By 1890, beavers had been completely eliminated from the San Pedro River system. The ecological consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Without beaver dams to slow water flow and recharge aquifers, the river began to change from a perennial stream to a seasonal wash. Flash floods carved deeper channels, draining underground water tables. The loss of beaver engineering triggered a cascade of environmental degradation that would continue for over a century. The destruction accelerated through the early 1900s as ranching and mining operations expanded throughout the watershed. Cattle grazing destroyed riparian vegetation, while copper mining operations diverted water for industrial use. By the 1950s, the San Pedro River had effectively ceased to exist as a flowing stream except during brief periods following heavy rains. The transformation was devastating. Where once permanent pools had supported year-round wildlife, there was now only dry sand and scattered rocks. The cottonwood forests died and weren't replaced. Bird populations collapsed as their habitat disappeared. Native fish species went extinct. What had been one of North America's most biodiverse river systems became an empty arroyo, indistinguishable from countless other dry washes throughout the Southwest. Local communities that had depended on the river for water and economic activity were forced to adapt or abandon their settlements. Towns that had thrived along the river as banks found themselves stranded in desert with no reliable water source. The cultural and economic impacts extended far beyond the immediate ecological losses. But perhaps most tragically, the institutional memory of what the San Pedro had been gradually disappeared. By the 1980s, most people in the region assumed that the dry arroyo was the natural state of the landscape. The idea that this desert wash had once been a flowing river supporting incredible biodiversity, seemed impossible to younger generations who had never seen water flow year-round through the desert. Environmental scientists, however, were beginning to understand the crucial role that beavers played in creating and maintaining wetland ecosystems. Research in other regions had demonstrated that beaver dams could dramatically increase water storage, raise groundwater levels, and create habitat for hundreds of species. The emerging science of restoration ecology suggested that reintroducing beavers to degraded landscapes could potentially restore ecosystem functions that had been lost for decades. Dr. Carol Evans from the Bureau of Land Management became convinced that beaver reintroduction could restore the San Pedro River system. Her analysis of historical records and geological evidence confirmed that the river's health had been entirely dependent on beaver engineering. Without beavers to create dams and slow water flow, the river system could never recover its historical functions. But the challenges seemed insurmountable. The San Pedro had been dry for over 40 years in most locations. There was no surface water to support aquatic mammals. The riparian vegetation that beavers depend on for food had long since disappeared. Most critically, there was no guarantee that reintroduced beavers could survive long enough to begin building the dams that might eventually restore water flow. Critics pointed out numerous problems with beaver reintroduction in desert environments. Beavers require year-round access to water and woody vegetation for survival. They are vulnerable to predation by mountain lions, coyotes, and bears, all of which were common in the San Pedro region. Most importantly, beavers are ecosystem engineers that modify landscapes, but they can't create water where none exists. The scientific establishment was largely skeptical of the proposal. Dr. Robert Johnson from the University of Arizona argued that beavers are aquatic mammals adapted to environments with permanent water. Releasing them in desert arroyos is essentially condemning them to death while wasting conservation resources that could be used more effectively elsewhere. Environmental groups were divided on the project. Some saw beaver reintroduction as a natural solution to landscape degradation that could restore ecosystem functions without expensive technological interventions. Others worried that the project would fail dramatically, setting back broader conservation efforts and providing ammunition for critics of restoration ecology. Local ranchers and land managers had additional concerns. Beaver dams could potentially change water flow patterns in unpredictable ways, affecting downstream water rights and land use patterns. There were also fears that successful beaver reintroduction could lead to restrictions on cattle grazing or other land uses in the watershed. International experts in beaver ecology were equally uncertain. While beaver reintroductions had been successful in other regions, those projects typically involved releasing animals into habitats that still retained some of the characteristics of healthy beaver ecosystems. The San Pedro represented something different, an attempt to use beavers to resurrect an ecosystem that had been completely transformed. But Dr. Evans and her team had one crucial advantage: detailed historical records that documented exactly how the San Pedro ecosystem had functioned before beaver elimination. Early military surveys, naturalist accounts, and photographs provided a blueprint for what the restored ecosystem should look like. More importantly, geological analysis suggested that the underground water tables that had once fed the river still existed, just at much lower levels than in the past. The reintroduction project, officially launched in 1999, began with the release of 8 beavers into a section of the San Pedro that showed the most promise for restoration. The site was chosen based on geological surveys that indicated shallow groundwater and the presence of scattered cottonwood trees that could provide initial food sources for the beavers. But even supporters of the project weren't entirely optimistic about the chances of success. The beavers would need to survive in an environment that was fundamentally different from their natural habitat, while somehow finding ways to begin the engineering work that might eventually restore that habitat. It was a classic chicken and egg problem. Beavers needed water to survive, but water needed beavers to return to the landscape. The first release took place on a scorching August morning in 1999, when temperatures reached 110 degrees Celsius, and the San Pedro riverbed was nothing but cracked earth and scattered rocks. 8 beavers, captured from thriving populations in Colorado, were transported in specially designed containers and released into what researchers hopefully called Pool 1, a depression in the riverbed that occasionally held water during flash floods. The early days were heartbreaking. Within the first month, 3 beavers died from heat stress and dehydration. 2 others simply disappeared, presumably falling victim to predators or dispersing in search of more suitable habitat. The surviving 3 beavers clustered around the few remaining cottonwood trees, desperately seeking shade and moisture in an environment that seemed fundamentally hostile to their survival. But something remarkable began to happen in September, when the desert's brief monsoon season brought the first significant rainfall in over 2 years. Flash floods filled the depression where the beavers had been released, creating a temporary pool that lasted for several weeks. Instead of simply waiting for the water to evaporate, the surviving beavers immediately began construction work. Using whatever materials they could find, mostly dead branches and debris from long-dead riparian vegetation, the beavers built their first dam across the narrow channel. It was a crude structure, barely 3 feet high and constantly threatened by erosion, but it worked. When the next flash flood arrived in October, instead of rushing past and disappearing downstream, the water was captured and held in an expanding pool behind the beaver dam. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the field biologist monitoring the project, described the moment as watching the desert come to life. The captured water began to seep into the ground, raising the local water table for the first time in decades. Dormant seeds in the soil, some of which had been waiting years for adequate moisture, began to germinate. Green shoots appeared around the edges of the pool, creating the first new riparian vegetation anyone had seen in the area for over 40 years. News of the dam's success prompted the release of 7 additional beavers in spring 2000. These new arrivals found an environment that, while still harsh, was fundamentally different from the bone-dry arroyo of the previous year. The original pool had expanded to cover nearly half an acre, and the surrounding vegetation was beginning to provide both food and building materials for dam construction. The beaver population responded rapidly to the improved conditions. Successful breeding occurred in 2001, producing the first beaver kits born in the San Pedro watershed in over 100 years. By 2002, 5 dams had been constructed along a half-mile stretch of the riverbed, creating a chain of pools that stored water year-round for the first time since the 1950s. But the real breakthrough came in 2003, when researchers made an extraordinary discovery. Groundwater monitoring wells throughout the area showed rising water tables, indicating that the beaver dams were successfully recharging underground aquifers. More remarkably, several springs that had been dry for decades began flowing again, fed by groundwater that was being restored by beaver engineering. The ecological responses accelerated rapidly after 2003. The chain of beaver pools created diverse aquatic habitats that attracted wildlife from throughout the region. Bird populations began recovering first, with species that hadn't been seen in the area for decades returning to nest in the expanding riparian vegetation. Amphibians and reptiles followed, taking advantage of the permanent water and growing insect populations. By 2005, the beaver population had grown to over 30 individuals distributed among multiple family groups. Each family maintained its own section of the river, building and maintaining dams that created an increasingly complex wetland ecosystem. The transformation was becoming visible from aerial photographs, with green ribbons of vegetation marking the locations of beaver activity in what had been uniform desert just a few years earlier. The success attracted additional funding and support from conservation organizations throughout the Southwest. The project expanded to include multiple release sites along different sections of the San Pedro, with new beavers being introduced annually to accelerate ecosystem recovery. Advanced monitoring systems tracked everything from water levels and vegetation growth to wildlife populations and soil chemistry. But perhaps the most significant development was the discovery that the restoration effects extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of beaver dams. The restored groundwater flow was affecting vegetation patterns up to a mile away from the river. Native plants that depended on shallow groundwater began recovering across broad areas of the watershed, creating habitat for wildlife species that had been absent from the region for decades. International attention began focusing on the San Pedro project as word spread about its extraordinary success. Researchers from around the world visited the site to study beaver restoration techniques and ecological recovery processes. The project became a model for similar efforts in other degraded river systems throughout the American West. Local attitudes toward the project had also transformed dramatically. Ranchers who had initially been skeptical of beaver reintroduction began to recognize the benefits of restored water tables and improved pasture conditions. Some voluntarily modified their grazing practices to support beaver habitat recovery, recognizing that the ecosystem services provided by beavers could benefit their operations. The economic impacts were becoming significant as well. Ecotourism focused on viewing restored beaver populations and recovering wildlife brought new revenue to rural communities that had struggled economically since the decline of mining and ranching. Birdwatching alone generated an estimated $2 million annually for the local economy as the San Pedro became recognized as one of Arizona's premier wildlife viewing destinations. By 2008, the beaver population had reached over 100 individuals, and their dams had created a continuous wetland corridor extending for over 15 miles along the San Pedro River. What had been 2,000 acres of desert wasteland had been transformed into functioning riparian ecosystem that supported over 200 species of birds and countless other wildlife species. But the most remarkable achievement was the return of year-round water flow to sections of the river that had been dry for over 50 years. Beaver dams had successfully restored the hydrology that allowed surface water to persist through even severe drought conditions. The engineering work of fewer than 200 beavers had accomplished what would have required hundreds of millions of dollars in technological solutions. Scientific analysis confirmed that the beaver restoration had recreated the essential ecosystem functions that had historically supported the San Pedro's biodiversity. Carbon sequestration in wetland soils was occurring at rates comparable to tropical forests. Water quality was improving as beaver ponds filtered sediments and pollutants. Most importantly, the restored ecosystem was proving to be resilient to drought and climate variability. The success had also created new research opportunities and scientific insights. The San Pedro project provided unprecedented data on how beaver engineering affects hydrology in arid environments. Studies of vegetation recovery, wildlife colonization, and ecosystem development were contributing to restoration ecology theory and practice worldwide. But the transformation was still accelerating. Each year brought new discoveries as the ecosystem continued to evolve and mature. Species that researchers hadn't expected to return were establishing populations in the restored habitat. The complexity and biodiversity of the recovering ecosystem was exceeding all projections. By 2010, the San Pedro beaver restoration had become one of the most closely studied ecosystem recovery projects in North America. The lessons learned were being applied to similar efforts throughout the western United States and in other arid regions worldwide. What had started as a desperate experiment to save a dead river had become a blueprint for large-scale ecosystem restoration. What happened over the following 15 years defied every prediction and transformed the San Pedro River into one of the most spectacular conservation success stories in American history. By 2024, the beaver population had exploded to over 300 individuals, and their engineering work had created a 40-mile continuous wetland corridor that supports more wildlife diversity than existed even before European settlement. But the numbers tell only part of an extraordinary story of ecosystem resurrection and ecological healing. The most remarkable development was the return of species that hadn't been seen in the region for over a century. In 2015, researchers documented the first jaguar tracks along the San Pedro River since 1905. By 2020, a breeding population of jaguars had established territories in the restored riparian forests, making the San Pedro the northernmost jaguar habitat in North America. These apex predators, which had been considered extinct in the United States, were thriving in ecosystems that beavers had recreated from nothing. Dr. Michael Rivera, who became the project director in 2018, described the wildlife recovery as beyond our wildest dreams. The restored ecosystem supported over 450 species of birds, more than had ever been documented in the area historically. New species were still being discovered regularly as the ecosystem continued to mature and develop greater complexity. Perhaps most astonishingly, several fish species that had been declared extinct were rediscovered in beaver ponds along the San Pedro. The Gila topminnow and desert pupfish, both thought to have been eliminated from the watershed in the 1960s, had somehow survived in isolated springs and were now thriving in the extensive aquatic habitats created by beaver dams. Genetic analysis confirmed that these were remnant populations of the original native fish, not introductions from other areas. The hydrology transformation was equally spectacular. The San Pedro now flowed year-round along its entire 40-mile restored section, creating the largest perennial stream in the Sonoran Desert. Groundwater levels had risen by an average of 15 feet throughout the watershed, affecting vegetation and wildlife patterns across over 50,000 acres of surrounding landscape. The restored water table had triggered what ecologists called landscape-scale greening. Native vegetation that depended on shallow groundwater was recovering across vast areas that had been desert for decades. Satellite imagery showed expanding green corridors extending miles beyond the river itself, creating habitat connectivity that supported wildlife movement across the entire region. Climate resilience was one of the most important benefits of the restoration. During the severe drought of 2020-2022, when most southwest rivers stopped flowing entirely, the San Pedro maintained surface water flow throughout the drought period. Beaver dams had created water storage systems that could sustain ecosystems through climatic extremes that would have been catastrophic for unmanaged landscapes. The carbon sequestration impacts were staggering. Wetland soils in the restored ecosystem were storing carbon at rates of 3 to 5 tons per acre annually, making the San Pedro one of the most effective carbon capture systems in North America. The total carbon storage was equivalent to removing 50,000 cars from the roads annually, all accomplished by natural processes driven by beaver engineering. Economic benefits had grown far beyond the initial ecotourism impacts. The restored ecosystem provided an estimated $15 million annually in ecosystem services, including water filtration, flood control, carbon storage, and biodiversity conservation. Property values throughout the watershed had increased significantly as the restored river became a major regional amenity. Agriculture in the region had been transformed by the rising water tables. Ranchers reported improved pasture conditions and reduced need for irrigation. Some operations had diversified into sustainable tourism and environmental education, creating new revenue streams while supporting conservation goals. The antagonistic relationship between ranching and conservation had evolved into productive partnerships. International recognition had made the San Pedro a global center for restoration research and education. Over 10,000 scientists, land managers, and students visited the site annually to study ecosystem recovery processes. The techniques developed on the San Pedro were being applied to restoration projects on 6 continents, creating a global network of beaver-based ecosystem restoration efforts. Universities from around the world had established research programs along the San Pedro, studying everything from beaver behavior and ecosystem engineering to climate change adaptation and biodiversity recovery. The accumulated research had generated over 200 scientific publications and was influencing ecosystem management policies worldwide. The success had also created new approaches to conservation funding and implementation. The San Pedro project demonstrated that relatively small investments in nature-based solutions could generate enormous returns in ecosystem services and economic benefits. This model was being applied to conservation projects throughout the American West and in other regions facing similar environmental challenges. Technology integration had enhanced the restoration's effectiveness and monitoring capabilities. Automated wildlife cameras, water level sensors, and drone surveys provided continuous data on ecosystem recovery. Artificial intelligence systems analyze this data to predict beaver behavior, optimize dam placement, and identify emerging restoration opportunities. The beaver population itself had evolved sophisticated behaviors adapted to desert conditions. Researchers documented new dam building techniques that maximized water capture and minimized evaporation losses. Some beaver families had developed seasonal migration patterns, moving between different dam sites based on water availability and resource conditions. Wildlife corridors created by the restored river had connected previously isolated habitat patches throughout southern Arizona and northern Mexico. Species movement patterns documented by GPS tracking showed that the San Pedro was functioning as a critical link in continental-scale migration routes for birds, bats, and large mammals. The restoration had also become a powerful symbol of hope for addressing climate change and biodiversity loss. The San Pedro proved that even severely degraded ecosystems could be restored to full functionality using nature-based solutions. This success story was inspiring similar efforts worldwide and changing attitudes about what was possible in environmental restoration. Cultural impacts extended throughout the region as a new generation grew up with the restored San Pedro as part of their natural heritage. Environmental education programs brought thousands of students to experience the restored ecosystem annually. The project had become a source of regional pride and identity, connecting communities to their environmental heritage. The scientific insights generated by 25 years of intensive monitoring were revolutionizing understanding of ecosystem restoration and resilience. The San Pedro data was being used to develop new theories about how ecosystems recover from severe disturbance and adapt to changing environmental conditions. By 2024, the cost-benefit analysis of the San Pedro restoration was overwhelming. The total investment of $12 million had generated ecosystem services worth over $400 million, making it one of the most cost-effective conservation investments ever documented. More importantly, the techniques developed on the San Pedro were being used to restore ecosystems worldwide, multiplying the global impact. The lesson of the San Pedro extends far beyond conservation biology. It demonstrates that nature's own engineering solutions are often far more effective and sustainable than technological alternatives. The beavers accomplished ecosystem restoration that would have been impossible using conventional engineering approaches, and they did it at a fraction of the cost while creating systems that will continue improving for decades. As hundreds of beavers continue their engineering work along the San Pedro River, they represent hope for healing damaged landscapes worldwide. They prove that even the most degraded ecosystems can be restored when we work with natural processes rather than against them. The transformation of lifeless desert into thriving wetland ecosystem shows that conservation victories are possible even in the face of severe environmental damage. The San Pedro River beavers are not just rebuilding an ecosystem, they are rebuilding our relationship with the natural world. They demonstrate that humans can be partners in restoration rather than agents of destruction. In a time of environmental crisis, the beavers of the San Pedro offer proof that recovery and renewal are possible when we give nature the chance to heal. The sight of beavers building dams in desert landscape that was once considered permanently damaged represents one of conservation's greatest victories. It proves that extinction of ecosystems, like extinction of species, doesn't have to be forever. With patience, science, and respect for natural processes, even the most ambitious restoration dreams can become reality.